Welcome, my name is Joe Dembeck, and during this session, I'm going to talk to you about how to survey a property in order to prepare a Maine Forest Service invasive plant control practice plan. A little background about myself. I am the former executive director of the Somerset County Soil and Water Conservation District, during which time I had the opportunity to survey approximately 30 properties for invasive plants and prepare the management plans for those properties. The learning objectives for this session are beginning to understand materials available for office review and planning. This can include imagery, the IMAP Invasives database, data sets like the Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife beginning with Habitat Map Viewer. A second item is the importance of identifying highly probable areas for invasive plant species and high quality areas that are located on the property. A third objective is field mapping and data collection techniques and technology while we're doing the on-site surveys. And briefly, the fourth objective will be field marking for revisitation needs. This can be done to help assist in follow-up field work, landowner needs and education, any future treatment needs. For me, I look at the invasive plant surveys as two separate phases. The first is the in-office phase where you're preparing to do the survey. This is looking at available data sets, gathering information to help assist you plan your survey in the field. And the second component is the actual field survey. And we'll talk some about the survey methods and data collection that one can use to complete these surveys. Probably one of the more useful items I found from the surveys I've completed is utilizing a landowner questionnaire form. There's an example of one on the Maine Forest Service website that myself and a colleague created in the past and we use quite often. Here's a subset of questions on the form. You're mainly looking for previous and current disturbances on the property and past management activities or current management activities. So, was there any recent timber harvests? Are there any planned timber harvests in the near future? Are there old cellars or foundations on the property, which kind of pinpoints areas to look at in detail due to the fact that many of those locations of old homesteads had the presence of non-native or invasive plant species that were purposely planted. Looking at, early successional habitat like unmanaged old fields, often an area that you'll find invasive plant species on a property. And asking about, are there any natural or planted conifer stands? From my experience, these kind of stands often are some of the initial sites on a property for invasive plant occurrence, likely due to the fact that these invasive plant species can withstand the acidic soil conditions in these stands, as well as the extremely low sun environment that these stands present. Likely it's due to the fact, from my experience, that these stands provide ideal nighttime roosting locations for birds. So they've been out feeding in the area, often are eating berries from invasive plant species, come back and roost for the evening, deposit the seeds with a little bit of nutrient packet overnight before they leave the roost in the morning. So areas that are highly susceptible to the establishment of invasive plant species. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to use an example property outlined here in red to assist us in talking about how we prepare for the survey in the office and when we actually perform it in the field. One of the first databases you want to look at is logging into IMAP Invasives to determine if there's any invasive plant data around the area you're going to survey. So when you log in to the database and zoom into Maine, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see this image that demonstrates the amount of data collected in different regions in the state. And it's very noticeable when you look at this that there's a lot more data from central Maine to southern Maine. And there's little or no data in a lot of western, northern, and down east Maine. So let's look at a typical example in the more data intensive area of central Maine. Here we're Unity Township is right there in the middle of the screen. And you can see there's been a lot of properties surveyed and there's a lot of data points that have confirmed presence of invasive species. Now we move to an area of Maine just south of Greenville, and you'll notice there's a lot less data available in the IMAP invasives database. There's a little bit there, but not as much as what we see in central Maine. For our example property, which is highlighted by the arrow, we notice there's not any available data immediately adjacent to the property, but there's a little bit to the west, as well as a fair amount to the north along the Route 2 corridor. Another database to look at is the Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's beginning with Habitat Online Map Viewer. When you open up the viewer, this is what you're going to see. I've zoomed in already to the example property area, and on the left you're going to see a number of different overlays that can be turned on or off, and a lot of the subgroups that are under each of those overlays. Here I've turned on the overlays for wildlife habitats and plants and natural communities. And we see a lot of information pop up in this image. So on and near this property, we see buffer zones around perennial streams, the Kennebec River. We see areas of yellow shading, which denote deer wintering areas. And then we also see this orange shading around the stream that borders the southern end of the property. And this denotes that there's a state threatened freshwater mussel species present in that stream. So it gives us an understanding of sensitive areas, high quality areas on or adjacent to the property, and some concerns out there. In this image, I've turned off the wildlife habitats and plant and natural communities, and I've turned on the conservation and connectivity planning resources layer. And this just gives you an understanding of how that property is positioned in the landscape. So here our example property is part of a contiguous 4,500 acres of undeveloped land. There is human activity and modification on the landscape between active farm fields, utility right-of-way, but this gives us an understanding of what's out there. Another item to review while you're preparing to survey a property is to look at any kind of maps or imagery that's available for that property or the area of the property. These can include aerial photos from different years, drone imagery if it's available, topographic maps, digital imagery from various resources. I typically use Google Earth. It's something I like to work with and I'm very familiar with. But any of these maps or images are going to help you understand what the property looks like before setting foot on it. Here's our example property in Google Earth. The earliest imagery we can find is from June of 1997. We can now step through the different updates of the imagery for this area to see what changes have occurred on and adjacent to the property. Here's the property in December of 2003, September of 2007, and take note that there was a 4-acre clear cut that was created on this property. So obviously an area that we want to look at during our survey because of that disturbance area, creating an open area for infestation of invasive plants, the spread of any invasive plants that were present there. Here's 2011. No changes on the property itself, but to the southeast, the abutting farmland has been expanded. So you have an area now of disturbance. So either the spread of invasives can occur in these disturbed areas, or the colonization of new invasive plant species could occur. Here's an image in 2018. So two significant changes have occurred in the area around this property. One is the property to the north had a significant harvest event occurring, so a huge disturbance there, as well as the power line corridor that runs through the property has been widened. Let's take a break at this point. Welcome back. So another item to look into during your preparation for the survey is creating lists of highly probable areas where invasive plants may be present and high quality areas on the property to survey. So what do I mean by these areas? Highly probable areas include utility right-of-ways, road frontage, field edges, hedgerows, old log landings, road trail systems, old homestead locations, the current homestead location, evergreen stands and plantations. Areas from my experience where you typically find invasive plant species if they're present on the property. High quality areas include riparian zones, areas identified with the beginning with Habitat Map Viewer review, forest interior, and areas of importance to a landowner. You want to get the landowner involved and motivated to document invasive plants on their property and set about trying to implement what you suggest in your management plan. You're going to have to determine where the property boundaries are. And that's going to be essential for your mapping for the Maine Forest Service requirements, but also for your in-field survey, obviously. And also, I tend to create field maps that highlight the property boundary as well as any unforested land locations on the property, be they fields, a gravel pit, something like that. So to assist you in making these maps and identifying property boundaries, look at tax map imagery from town websites, the Maine Office of GIS layers for both organized and unorganized towns, depending upon where you're working, and information from the property owner. They may have an existing survey of their property boundaries. They may know where the stakes are for corners or other monuments on the property line. Do they have a forest management plan? Does that demonstrate to you where the property lines are? And do they have any markings on their property lines? Blazes, postings, flagging, just something to help you understand and prepare when you're out there in the field what's on the property and what's off the property. We've completed preparing for the survey, and now it's actually the time to get out there and perform the survey. Probably the component of this work that we most enjoy, and there's a number of aspects that I think you should look at while you're in the field performing a survey. The first is to drive or walk any road frontage on the property. This is extremely important because these road frontage areas often are initial sites of colonization by invasive plant species or the establishment of a seed base there that is slowly moving into the property. You also will have already determined the best method for surveying the property. Do you look at surveying field edges, high priority areas such as high quality areas, and highly probable areas? Or have you decided, yes, I've noted those areas, but I'm going to do a continuous grid search throughout the whole property? This is going to be dependent on multiple things. It's going to be dependent upon the land cover type, It's a lot easier to walk through a more mature forest than it is early successional habitat. Um, it's easier to walk property that's high and dry versus one that may contain a large wetland. So this component here ties into the next one, which is realistic minimum mapping unit. So if you have a 20-acre property, realistically you should touch each of those 20 acres in your survey. You have ample time, but also it's the size of the property isn't overbearing. The difference would be if you had a 300-acre property, you may not be able to do a full grid search of that just because of the extent of time available. So that's where you're maybe going to go in and look at those highly probable areas of infestation, high quality areas or areas of importance on the property. Walk through road systems. If there's openings or fields, look at the edges of those. Do grid-based searches in a subset of the property based upon what you find there. So you may have walked 150 of the 300 acres of that property when you're all said and done. But you have to base this aspect upon what you find in the field and in a manner that's exhaustive enough to document the presence or absence of invasive plant species. So you're out there, you find invasive plant species. How do you want to collect that data? I have kept this very general. I'm not saying you have to use this kind of program on a tablet or use a GPS with this kind of electronic data sheet. We all have our differences in how we like to handle data, both in collecting it, storing it, and reviewing it. Some of us are going to be fully electronic capable. Others of us will be like myself that, love to use a GPS for taking down waypoints, for doing tracks, but I like a paper data sheet for writing down all of my information, as well as having printed out copies of the maps of the property with me so I can make notes on that also. So you're out there, you're finding invasive plants, and then it's going to be the determination of how you want to denote those presence of plants. Are you going to take individual points for plants that are sporadic on the property? Are you finding that there's a larger amount of invasive plants, so you want to use polygons, be they circles or rectangles or trapezoids, say, of areas of infestation? Or you've walked along a field edge and you see, hey, there's along this field edge there's shrubby honeysuckle and bittersweet sporadically. You decide I'm going to make this whole field edge a line, and I'm going to add a buffer because I think it goes into the woods about 30 feet, this infestation. So you can break down either to individual plants or lumping more into polygons or lines when you're in the field. That's going to determine how you then map that information in IMAP invasives, as well as you display in the management plan. You're also going to be taking down information regarding, for each of these points or polygons or lines, what's the invasive species mix? What's the plant age of each of those invasive species? Are there just seedlings present? Are there just mature plants present? Are there a combination of mature, immature, and mature plants present? Definitely take note if you find berries or fruit or seeds on invasive plants, so you know that these could be a seed source. And then also you want to estimate, when you're dealing with polygons or line data, what's the percentage cover in that area denoted? Is it 5% of the land? Is it 80% of that land in that polygon that has invasive species? It's all going to assist you in mapping all this information in IMAP invasives. It's going to help you as the bigger picture comes together when you've completed your survey and you have all that data in front of you, when you start determining, hey, how are we going to address these issues in the management plan? So there's a lot that you need to collect here in detail, but it's going to be extremely important for you later. For example, here is a property I surveyed in the past. So I just downloaded my GPS after doing the field survey, and here's a bunch of points on the property. Doesn't look like much right now, but these points all correspond to information on a paper data sheet. And also my maps of the property have notes and areas highlighted on it. So this is the rough download of the digital data. And then from there, after I was done with all the data entry in IMAP invasives and looking at the data across the whole property, this is the image I came up with for all the invasive infestations on the property. So some areas you can see individual data points. They're very small, yellow-green dots. Those typically tend to be a plant or a few plants. We can see examples of lines of infestation on the property, especially to the right side of the property along the agricultural field. You can see a buffered line that demonstrates that whole area has some component of infestation. And then we also can see an area that didn't have any GPS points on the previous image, but is a large green area in the middle of the property. That was a black spruce plantation that, when surveyed, showed a high density of shrubby honeysuckle, Asiatic bittersweet, and Japanese barberry. So the data points weren't necessary to denote the field because I utilized one of my maps and drew in and denoted that this area of the plantation, which was the entirety, had a significant level of infestation. So this is an example of how electronic data and other information is put together to create a final infestation map. It's very dependent upon you as the user and how you create your data, how you store it. But this is just an example of how things come together to show that first image of infestation on a property. Continuing on, you're going to definitely need to keep track of your survey route, as it's required for the Maine Forest Service mapping, as well as verification of the survey extent on the property. Obviously, the best way to do this is to have a track setting on a GPS turned on, or a tablet with a mapping program that can actually follow you throughout. I often, at times, back that up with drawing on a map of the property, because every once in a while, electronic devices have a hiccup, and there's nothing worse than being out there downloading and realizing, oh, you lost connectivity for some reason for a bit of time. But if you have notes or drew in roughly where you went and how you walked through the property, it's going to be helpful in recreating the survey routes. Extremely important, number 6. Check all those areas you identified in the office that are highly probable for invasives or are high quality areas on the property. These are areas that you should, once identified and prior to the field survey, that you need to look at every single one of them when you do the field survey. And also you have to ensure that you surveyed the property in a time frame based upon the acreage and infestation level meets the requirements of the Maine Forest Service. So here's a table from the guidelines for natural resource professionals creating these plans. So our example property was 120 acres. So that would kind of fall right in between the level of infestation and acreage chart here, between 100 and 150. So you can see the lower the infestations on the property, the less hours that are expected at a minimum to be expended surveying the property. But as you get higher levels of infestation, you're going to be spending more time on the property, because obviously you're going to be taking a lot more field data, but you also want to understand how those infestations occur on the property and how they correspond to each other. Because again, you're trying to determine with all this data collection, a management strategy or strategies that will assist the landowner at least containing, if not decreasing, potentially eradicating these invasive species from their property. So let's go to our example property. We're out there, we're beginning our survey. Where on this example property are we going to be doing a lot of focus? Obviously, one of them we noted earlier, there was a 4-acre clear cut in 2007. Definitely going to look at that in its entirety. The edges of that clear cut, probably doing a grid search throughout that clear cut to determine the presence of invasive plant species. From the landowner questionnaire, we know that this location here, the landowner plans in the near future to do another clear cut of similar size. So to assist the landowner in their management of their property, I would look at this location both for the area planned to be clear cut as well as the surrounding area for the presence of invasive plant species, because that will determine your suggestions for management of this property. There's 2 natural white pine stands on this property from regenerating from cropland. Obviously, areas to fully investigate while you're doing your survey. A huge one that stands out is the power line corridor. All edges of the property along this power line corridor need to be surveyed. The road system on the property obviously should be surveyed because this is the pathway of movement through the property. There's been gravel brought into this property or other fill. Equipment may come in and off this property, as well as these areas of disturbance often provide initial infestation locations. And of course, the whole perimeter of the field in the center of the property, as well as the homestead along the river, should be looked at. One final thing when you're out there doing the surveys that I think is important for you, the natural resource professional, and also for assisting the landowner in any future follow-up work, is marking of invasive plant species in the field, visually marking them with flagging. Obviously, you can take point locations with a GPS or using a mapping program, but by visually flagging them, that's going to help out in many areas. If you find one burning bush on the property, you probably want to flag that. It's a unique presence on that property, and it's also something that obviously should be immediately remediated because it's one species that can be actually eradicated from the property. Yes, you can go back with a GPS, but it's not always certain that the person going back to take care of that burning bush has a GPS. So by flagging it, it really is helpful for identification. Also at times when you're trying to figure out how large an infestation area is, be it a hedgerow or a location in the woods, sometimes along with your GPS points, adding some flagging might visually assist you in reviewing an area. When you've talked with the landowner before the survey, you should always ask them, hey, do you want me to mark, i.e. flag, certain invasive plant species for you? They may say yes, like I don't know what shrubby honeysuckle is, or I don't know what common buckthorn looks like. And if those species are present, flagging some representative examples of them will help the landowner learn identification better, but may also spur them on to be more aggressive in their management of invasive species on the property. Additionally, you do your survey. You've identified some areas that need to be treated. You might flag these areas because that landowner may go in and remove those or treat those plants themselves, or they may hire somebody to go in. So it's always good to have a marking out there that visually reminds you, hey, this is something to address. Oftentimes, besides using the invasive plant flagging, I usually will mark on the flagging the species type or something like that. It's helpful. For those of you that are working in a setting that has a lot of public use, this is a great educational tool for the public. If you're working on a land trust property or private property that somebody has a lot of users on, by flagging areas or representative examples of species, it'll get people talking more about it and increasing their knowledge base about it, as well as increasing their concern about the extent of this problem in our woodlands. So we've gone over two aspects today: how to prepare to survey in the office, what databases and information is out there that can assist you prior to you setting foot in the field. And we've briefly gone over how you're going to survey when you're in the field and why. We're all going to have our unique focus on how we do this, but I think in general your approach is going to be similar to mine. Obviously we could go into more details about data sheets and such, but really that's going to be up to the individual and depending upon how you collect and treat data. So with that, I'm going to end this session. I thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions or want to provide any feedback or have some suggestions on different ways of approaching, please reach out to me. My email address is here as well as my telephone number. So I thank you for taking this course and I wish you the best of luck in your work in the field.